3 years later, when the histories were being written and the court archivists came looking for her name, Maren Aldous would already be gone. She would be back on a mid-belt relay station called Threshold 9, elbow-deep in a junction box, splicing copper core leads with the same battered pair of lineman's pliers she had carried for 31 years. The archivists would find her work log, her temporary access badge, and the handwritten note she had left on the king's desk, 4 words, no signature. They would not find her. But that was later. This is the night the lights went out in the citadel of Reth. The Rithani power grid was old. Not old the way human infrastructure got old, patched, upgraded, layered over with newer systems until the original bones were buried under decades of revision. Old the way a religion gets old. The grid had been designed by the architect primes during the second founding, 1700 years before Maren was born, and in all that time no one had redesigned it because no one believed it needed redesigning. It was sacred engineering. The conduit paths followed the lay geometries of the founding charter. The switching relays were inscribed with devotional script. The main distribution hub beneath the citadel's great hall was called the Heartstone, and it was tended by a priestly caste of royal engineers who wore white coats and spoke of voltage the way earth theologians spoke of grace. It had been failing for 11 months. Not catastrophically. Not in the dramatic way that made for good crisis: no explosions, no cascading blackouts, no sparks raining from the ceiling while courtiers screamed. The Rithani grid failed the way an aging heart fails, intermittently, unpredictably, in ways that embarrassed the physicians who could not find the cause. Lights flickered in the throne room during audiences. Climate control stuttered in the royal nurseries. The defensive shield array, the citadel's primary military protection, a barrier of interlocked energy fields that had held against 3 invasions, dropped to 60% efficiency, then 50, then 41. The numbers kept sliding. Nobody could stop them. Maren knew all of this because she read the job posting. She was 58 years old, and she had been an electrician for 34 of those years. Not an engineer, she was careful about the distinction, the way all tradespeople were careful about the distinctions that the credentialed classes blurred. Engineers designed systems. Electricians kept them alive. Engineers worked from diagrams and simulations and theoretical models. Electricians worked from the wire itself, its gauge, its insulation, its resistance, the particular hum it made when current passed through it at different loads. Maren had learned to read that hum the way a doctor learned to read a pulse. She could put her hand on a conduit and tell you whether the current was clean or dirty, steady or surging, nominal or 3 weeks from failure. It was not magic. It was 34 years of standing in utility closets and crawlspaces and relay rooms, listening to what the copper had to say. Her hands told the story of those years. Thick calluses across the palm and the base of each finger, built up layer by layer from gripping pliers and wire strippers and conduit brackets. A scar on the left index finger where a live terminal had bitten her in her 3rd year on the job, the year she learned that you never trusted the breaker panel until you tested the wire yourself. Knuckles that ached in cold weather, permanently swollen from years of working in spaces designed for tools, not hands. She kept her nails trimmed short. She kept her grip strong. She did not wear rings. Rings and live current were a combination you only got wrong once. The job posting was buried in the Human Labor Exchange on Threshold 9, filed under Temporary Infrastructure Maintenance Cultural Exchange Program. The pay was modest. The duration was listed as until resolved. The location was the citadel of Reth, which Maren had heard of the way most humans heard of it, as the seat of the Rithani monarchy, one of the oldest continuous governments in the galactic core, ruled by a king whose lineage went back further than most species' written histories. She had also heard it was beautiful. She did not apply because of beauty. She applied because the relay station's contract was ending and she needed work. She did not apply because she thought she could fix a 1700-year-old alien power grid. She applied because the posting said they needed someone who could trace conduit faults, and tracing conduit faults was what she did. She arrived on a cargo shuttle, carrying one duffel bag and a tool roll that weighed more than the bag. The tool roll held her pliers, her voltage tester, her wire strippers, a hand-wound continuity probe she had built herself from salvaged components, a set of miniature screwdrivers with insulated handles, a soldering pen she had rebuilt twice, and a coil of copper core lead that she kept away. Some people kept a lucky coin, not because she believed in luck, but because good copper was getting harder to find and she did not trust the synthetic substitutes. The citadel was enormous. Pale stone, vaulted ceilings, corridors wide enough to drive a transport through. The Rithani themselves were tall 7 feet on average, with skin the color of cold silver and eyes that glowed faintly amber in low light, like embers behind smoked glass. They moved through their palace with the unhurried grace of people who had never been told to move faster. Their clothing was layered, formal, threaded with metallic fibers that caught the light and shifted color as they walked. Subtle pointed ears. Cheekbones cut sharp enough to cast shadows. They were beautiful in the way that old cathedrals were beautiful, symmetrical, deliberate, built to last. They did not look at Marin. She was surface maintenance, the lowest designation in the Citadel's labor hierarchy. Her access badge was gray, the color of temporary staff, interchangeable beneath notice. She was assigned quarters in the service corridor behind the Eastern Generator Annex, a room the size of a storage closet with a cot, a wash basin, and a window that looked out on a ventilation shaft. She unpacked her duffel. She hung her tool roll on the back of the door. She reported to the maintenance overseer, a Rithani man named Prefect Doran, who glanced at her badge, glanced at her face, and assigned her to conduit inspection in the lower service tunnels. "Start at Junction 7, he said. "Work inward. Report faults to my office. Do not enter the Heartstone chamber. Do not speak to the Royal Engineers. Do not touch any system you are not qualified to assess." "Understood," Marin said. Doran did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had trained, or how many years she had in the field, or what system she was experienced with. She was a gray badge. Gray badges were assigned tasks, not consulted. She accepted this the way she accepted gravity, as a fact of the environment she was operating in, worth understanding but not worth arguing about. She had worked in hierarchies her entire life. Every hierarchy believed its own ranking system was the natural order of the universe. The Rithani were no different. She went to Junction 7. She started working. The lower tunnels were the Citadel's circulatory system, a network of conduit paths, switching nodes and relay junctions that carried power from the Heartstone to every room, every corridor, every shield emitter in the fortress. They were poorly lit, cramped by Rithani standards, which meant merely tight by human standards, and they smelled of ozone and old stone. The conduits themselves were beautiful hand-laid copper alloy, sheathed in a crystalline insulation that had been state-of-the-art 17 centuries ago and was still, Marin had to admit, remarkably sound. The metallurgy was precise. The routing was elegant. The architect primes had known what they were doing. But something was wrong. Marin heard it on her second day. Not a sound anyone else would have noticed. The Rithani Royal Engineers certainly had not, or if they had dismissed it. It was a harmonic, a faint oscillation in the current, barely perceptible, riding underneath the normal 60-cycle hum of the grid like a whisper beneath a conversation. She pressed her palm against the conduit wall at Junction 9 and closed her eyes. The harmonic was irregular. It surged and faded on a pattern she could not immediately identify, not random, but not rhythmic either, something between a pulse and a stammer. She had heard harmonics like it before, on old Earth installations where the original wiring had degraded and the impedance had shifted enough to create standing waves in the current flow. It usually meant one of two things: a grounding fault somewhere upstream, or a resonance loop between two systems that were never designed to talk to each other. She knelt on the tunnel floor for 20 minutes, her palm against the crystalline sheathing, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She was not meditating. She was working. The palm of a trained electrician's hand was a diagnostic instrument, not as precise as a spectral analyzer, but more intuitive, more responsive to the subtle variations in vibration that formal instruments filtered out as noise. Maren had spent 3 decades training her palm to hear what machines dismissed. The harmonic was faint, but it was real, and it was wrong. She filed a report. Junction 9, subsurface conduit path, anomalous harmonic detected, recommend full-spectrum impedance scan. The report went to Prefect Doran. Doran forwarded it to the Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers sent back a one-line response. The founding grid does not produce anomalous harmonics. The human maintenance worker is instructed to continue visual inspection only. Maren read the response. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She went back to Junction 9 and kept listening. Over the next 3 weeks, the grid failures accelerated. The defensive shields dropped to 38%. The king's personal chambers lost power during a diplomatic reception, leaving the monarch and 6 visiting ambassadors sitting in darkness for 11 minutes while the Royal Engineers scrambled to reroute from a backup node. The backup node held for 2 days, then failed with the same harmonic signature. A second backup was activated. It developed the identical oscillation within hours. A third was brought online from the reserve system. It lasted 9 hours before the lights in the military wing began to pulse in a slow, a rhythmic strobe that made the guards nauseous. The court was in quiet crisis. Maren knew this not because anyone told her, no one told surface maintenance anything, but because the tunnels carried sound, and sound carried politics. She heard the arguments through the conduit shafts. The Minister of Infrastructure, Lord Seveth, was blaming the Royal Engineers for incompetence. The Royal Engineers, led by Architect Prime Veles, were blaming material degradation and requesting a 6-week diagnostic window. The military liaison, Commander Thren, was demanding immediate shield restoration and did not care who was blamed as long as it got done. And a fourth voice had entered the conversation, Lord Kivrin, head of the Trade Council, who saw the grid crisis as an opportunity to push for off-world engineering contractors and the lucrative trade agreements that would follow them. Each faction had its solution. Seveth wanted new engineering leadership, specifically his own appointee. Veles wanted more time and more deference to the founding specifications. Thren wanted military control of the grid, which would let her bypass Seveth entirely. Kivrin wanted foreign specialists and the political capital their contracts would bring. All 4 solutions shared one feature. None of them involved actually fixing the grid. They were about positioning. Maren listened to all of it, the factions maneuvering, the positions hardening, the solutions proliferating, and she felt the particular, familiar frustration of a tradesperson watching decision-makers argue about plumbing. They were debating who should fix the sink. Nobody was looking at the pipes. She kept mapping the harmonic. She traced it from Junction 9 to Junction 14, then to Junction 19, then through a secondary conduit branch she had not initially known existed, a bypass path the Rithani had installed 3 centuries ago when they added the climate control network. The bypass had its own harmonic, a sub-oscillation that fed back into the primary wave and amplified it. She mapped the whole thing with her continuity probe, a hand-drawn diagram on a scrap of packing paper, and her ears. The harmonic was getting louder. It was also getting more complex, layering on itself, building secondary oscillations that interfered with the primary signal and created dead spots in the power distribution. The dead spots were where the failures were occurring. Every flickering light, every climate control stutter, every percentage point the shields dropped, all of it traced back to the harmonic. She understood the problem by the end of the third week. The founding grid had been designed as a closed system, a single, self-contained network with no external inputs. 1700 years ago, that was all it needed to be. But over the centuries, the Rithani had added systems. The shield array, which drew power from the grid but operated on a different frequency. The climate control network, retrofitted 400 years ago with components manufactured off-world. The communication relays, the lighting upgrades, the automated door systems, the medical wing backup generators. Layer after layer of new technology grafted onto a grid that had never been designed to carry anything but its own original load. Each addition had been engineered competently in isolation. Each one, taken alone, was well built, but no one had ever checked whether the old grid and the new systems were electrically compatible at the junction level. No one had matched the impedances. No one had tuned the harmonics. And why would they? The founding grid was sacred. You did not question sacred engineering. You bolted your new system onto it and assumed the architect prime's work would absorb whatever you threw at it. For 16 centuries it had. The original architect primes had built in enough headroom, enough tolerance in the copper alloy, enough flexibility in the resonance profile that the grid could absorb a reasonable amount of foreign impedance without destabilizing. And for 1600 years, the additions had stayed within that envelope. But the shield array, 400 years ago, had pushed the grid to 90% of its tolerance. The climate control retrofit had pushed it to 95%. The communication relays and the automated systems had pushed it to 98%. And somewhere in the last century, somebody had connected the medical wing's backup generators without checking the junction impedance, and the grid had quietly crossed the line from tolerable to terminal. But margins erode. The mismatches compounded. The standing wave built. And now the grid was dying not because it was old, but because it was lonely. It was a 1700-year-old instrument trying to play in an orchestra it had never been tuned for, and the harmonic was the sound of it struggling to keep up. The fix was not a redesign. It was not a replacement. It was a retuning, a set of impedance-matching splices at every junction where a newer system connected to the old grid, hand-calibrated to bring the harmonics back into alignment. It was the electrical equivalent of tuning a piano. You did not replace the strings. You adjusted the tension until they sang together instead of fighting. Maren knew how to do it. She had done it 100 times on Earth, on stations where old and new wiring lived in the same walls and argued with each other through the copper. It was basic electrical work, journeyman level, the kind of thing you learned in your first 5 years if you worked on legacy systems, and that you perfected over the next 29. The problem was that no one was going to let her do it. She was surface maintenance, gray badge, temporary. She had no authority to touch the grid, no standing to speak to the royal engineers, and no political leverage to force anyone to listen. The citadel's hierarchy was absolute. The royal engineers answered to Sevath. Sev answered to the king. The king answered to no one. And somewhere in that chain of command, a human electrician with a hand-wound continuity probe and 34 years of experience was not even a variable in the equation. Maren filed another report. 6 pages, handwritten because the maintenance terminals did not have the resolution for waveform diagrams. She described the harmonic, its source, its propagation path, and the proposed fix. She included impedance calculations for 5 of the worst junction mismatches. She included a timeline, 4 days to complete the work if she started immediately. She delivered it to Doran's office personally. Doran read the first page. He set it down. This is not within your scope. The grid is failing because of impedance mismatches at the system integration junctions. I can show you. Your scope is visual inspection and conduit fault reporting. This, he tapped the report, is a diagnostic assessment. You are not qualified to make diagnostic assessments. I have been an electrician for 34 years. You are surface maintenance. He said it the way you would say the sky is up, a fact so fundamental it did not warrant discussion. I will forward this to the Royal Engineers for review. Return to your assigned section. The Royal Engineers did not review the report. Marin knew this because she checked Doran's outgoing message log 3 days later. The maintenance office was not well secured, and the terminal's access history was visible to anyone who knew where to look. The report had been filed under unsolicited external contractor, no action required. The shields dropped to 31%. 3 days later, they dropped to 29%. The political maneuvering intensified. The crisis had crossed a threshold, no longer an embarrassment to be managed, but an existential threat to be exploited. Each faction recalculated its position against the new reality. If the grid failed completely, whoever controlled the response would control the citadel's future. Sevaith moved against Veles openly, submitting a formal petition to the king recommending her replacement. Veles countered by releasing her department's full diagnostic data to the court record, 800 pages of spectral analysis that proved, conclusively, that the founding grid's core architecture was sound, which was true, and which missed the point entirely, and which she knew missed the point because Marin could hear the tightness in her voice when she presented it through the conduit shaft above the council chamber. Thren submitted a military threat assessment. At 31% shield integrity, the Citadel was vulnerable to a sustained orbital bombardment for the first time in 400 years. The Vorath Compact, the Rithani's nearest rival, had noticed. Kivrin's intelligence contacts confirmed that the Compact's ambassador had been making inquiries about the shield fluctuations. Polite inquiries, the kind that preceded impolite ones. And behind all of them, saying very little but listening to everything, sat King Arathan. Marin had seen him once from a distance, crossing the great hall while she was on her hands and knees checking a floor-level junction box. He was tall even for a Rithani, nearly 7.5 feet, with the silver-white hair and amber eyes common to the royal lineage, and a face that looked like it had been designed by a sculptor who believed in clean angles and permanent composure. He walked the way all Rithani royals walked, unhurried, deliberate, as if the floor existed for the specific purpose of being beneath his feet. He did not look at her. She was below the threshold of visibility, a gray badge on her hands and knees, indistinguishable from the floor she was inspecting, as much a part of the infrastructure as the junction box itself. She did not need him to look at her. She needed him to listen. But listening required someone to carry the message upward through a hierarchy designed to prevent exactly that, designed, in fact, on the principle that wisdom flowed downward from the founding and upward from nowhere. She heard his voice through the conduit shafts, late at night, when the court had emptied and only essential staff remained. He was speaking with Sevaith. "How long?" "The engineers estimate 6 to 8 weeks for a full diagnostic, Your Sovereignty." "We do not have 6 weeks. Thren's latest assessment puts shield integrity at 30% by week's end. If the Vorath Compact decides to test us, we will know within days. I need the grid stable." "The engineers are working." "The engineers have been working for 11 months. Find me someone who can actually fix it." The silence that followed carried the particular weight of a king who had stopped asking and started telling. Marin continued her survey. She completed the full map of the harmonics propagation path, all 47 junction mismatches identified, their impedance deviations calculated, the correction values documented. She added the map to her original 6-page report, bringing it to 12 pages of hand-drawn diagrams and hand-calculated specifications. She did not file it again. She kept it in her tool roll between the pliers and the wire strippers, where it would be ready if someone ever asked. On the 29th day, she walked past the main corridor on her way to the lower tunnels and saw something that made her stop. A delegation of Vorath Compact officers was being escorted through the Citadel by Kivrin's trade attachés. The officers were shorter than the Rithani but broader, with pale blue skin and the sharp, appraising eyes of military professionals conducting a threat assessment while pretending to admire the architecture. One of them, a woman with the insignia of a fleet intelligence officer on her collar, was looking at the ceiling lights, at the flicker, counting the frequency, the way Marin herself would have counted it. The Voreth officer caught Marin's eye, a gray badge and a fleet intelligence officer looking at each other across the width of a palace corridor, both of them seeing the same thing, a fortress whose defenses were failing. The officer's expression was not hostile. It was professional. It said, "I have what I came for." Marin went to the tunnels and worked faster. On the 32nd day, the main lighting array in the Great Hall failed during a session of the full court. The hall went dark for 7 seconds. When the backup systems engaged, they came up at half intensity, casting the court in a dim amber glow that made the silver-skinned Rithani look like ghosts of themselves. The king, seated on the ash throne, did not move. He sat perfectly still while his court murmured and the engineers scrambled and Commander Thren's personal guard formed a perimeter that was completely unnecessary and entirely political, a physical demonstration of military readiness in the middle of a political argument. It was Thren who made the move. Not out of strategy, Marin would later understand, but out of genuine frustration. The commander was a soldier, not a politician, and she was watching her defensive capability erode while 4 factions argued about jurisdiction. "Your sovereignty," Thren said, standing at attention in the half-lit hall. "The Foreign Labor Exchange has a registered electrical specialist currently working in the lower service tunnels. She filed a diagnostic report 3 weeks ago that was buried by the maintenance overseer's office. I have reviewed it. I request permission to bring her before the court." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a hierarchy being violated in public. Marin, listening from a conduit access point 2 floors below, felt her stomach tighten. Zeve spoke first. "Commander, you are proposing to bring a gray badge maintenance worker before the full court." "I am proposing to bring someone who might fix the grid before the Voreth Compact notices our shields are at 30%. 31, Veles corrected quietly. 31, Thren repeated. "Which will be 28 by next week at the current rate of decline. And then it will not matter who has jurisdiction, because there will be nothing left to have jurisdiction over." Kivrin raised a hand. "If I may, I have been in discussions with the Syndicate Technical Consortium regarding." "The Syndicate will take 14 weeks to deploy," Thren said. "We have 2. The king raised one hand. The hall went quiet. "Bring her," he said. They found Marin in tunnel section 12, on her knees beside junction 19, her continuity probe clipped to a conduit bracket, and her ear pressed against the crystalline insulation. She was wearing her gray work coveralls, which had acquired a fine layer of stone dust and conduit grease over the past month. Her tool roll was open on the floor beside her. Her hair, steel gray and cut short for practical reasons, was pushed behind her ears with a strip of electrical tape she had repurposed as a headband. Her hands were dark with copper oxide from working barehanded on old conduit fittings. The guard who came for her was polite in the way that Rithani military personnel were polite when they did not know how to categorize the person they were addressing, somewhere between deference and confusion. He told her the court wanted her. She asked if she could wash her hands first. He said there was not time. She rolled up her tools, slung the roll over her shoulder and followed him up. They walked through the service tunnels to the main corridor, then up 2 flights of stairs designed for Rithani legs, each step 18 inches high, which meant Marin was climbing rather than walking by the time they reached the upper level. The guard slowed his pace without comment. He had noticed. Most Rithani did not notice things like stair height when they were walking beside a species 1.5 feet shorter than they were. This one did. Marin filed that away, a small indicator that the military, at least, had been trained to pay attention to the people they were responsible for, regardless of badge color. The corridors of the upper citadel were different from the tunnels. Where the tunnels were functional raw stone, exposed conduit, utility lighting, the upper levels were ceremonial. The walls were sheathed in polished pale stone, veined with threads of crystal that caught and multiplied the light from overhead arrays. The floor was a single continuous pour of something that looked like marble, but had a warmth to it that marble never had, as if the stone itself were faintly heated from within. The ceiling rose in arches that met at keystones carved with the founding script, the same script that adorned the switching relays in the tunnels below, but here rendered in silver inlay rather than scratched copper. Marin walked through it in her gray coveralls and her electrical tape headband in her copper-stained hands, and she felt what every tradesperson felt when they walked through the front door of a building they had only ever entered through the service entrance. Visible. Uncomfortably, conspicuously visible. A lord in metallic robes glanced at her and looked away. A pair of court pages, barely 4 feet tall by Rithani standards, stared openly until the guard's posture made them stop. A maintenance drone, the only piece of technology in the corridor that Marin felt any kinship with, whirred past at floor level, its sensors sweeping the baseboards, doing its job without anyone watching. The Great Hall was the largest interior space Marin had ever stood in. The ceiling was a vaulted dome of pale stone and crystal-threaded glass that, under normal conditions, would have blazed with the grid's full-spectrum lighting array. Under current conditions, it glowed dully, like a lamp running on dying batteries. The court was assembled in a semicircle around the ash-throned lords and ministers in their metallic-threaded robes, military officers in fitted silver uniforms, the royal engineers in their white coats, all of them 7 feet tall, silver-skinned, amber-eyed, and looking at Marin with expressions that ranged from guarded curiosity to barely concealed offense. She was 5'6". She was covered in tunnel grime. She had a tool roll over her shoulder and a strip of electrical tape in her hair and copper oxide stains on her fingers that no amount of quick washing would remove. The oxide had worked into the skin itself, into the whorls of her fingerprints, turning the pads of her hands a faint greenish bronze that was as permanent as the calluses beneath it. She looked exactly like what she was, a working electrician who had been interrupted mid-job and who was, very quietly, annoyed about it. The king regarded her from the ash throne, up close or as close as the court's protocol allowed, which was about 30 feet. He was imposing not through size alone but through stillness. He had the quality of something geological, patient, weathered, immovable. "Your name," he said. "Marin Aldis, human electrical specialist, temporary surface maintenance." "I do not need your badge designation. Commander Thren tells me you filed a report on the grid's condition 3 weeks ago." "I did. And it was not acted upon." "It was not." "Tell me what it said." Marin looked at the court. She looked at Sevaith, whose face was a mask of controlled displeasure. She looked at Veles, whose white coat was immaculate and whose hands were clasped behind her back with the rigid discipline of someone who wanted very badly to interrupt. She looked at Kivrin, who was watching with the bright, calculating interest of a man who smelled opportunity regardless of outcome. She looked at Thren, who gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Your grid is dying," Marin said, "because nobody taught it how to talk to the systems you have been bolting onto it for the last 400 years. The silence was total. She continued. She did not soften it. She did not translate it into the ceremonial language the court preferred, did not frame it as a hypothesis or a possibility or a suggestion for further study. She spoke the way she would speak to a building superintendent on a relay station, plain, direct, with the particular flatness of someone describing a physical reality that did not care about anyone's feelings and would keep being true whether they liked it or not. She explained the harmonic. She explained the impedance mismatches. She explained how each retrofitted system shields, climate control, communications, medical, everything added after the founding had shifted the grid's resonance profile by a fraction, and how those fractions had compounded over centuries into a standing wave that was eating the grid from inside. She pulled her hand-drawn diagrams from her coverall pocket, unfolded them on the floor in front of the throne like a mechanic spreading blueprints on a shop floor, and walked the king through the waveform data she had collected over 4 weeks of crawling through his tunnels. "The founding grid is brilliant," she said. "Your architect primes built something that should have lasted forever, and it would have if you had left it alone, but you did not. You added systems. You had to. That is what civilizations do. The problem is not the additions. The problem is that nobody matched the impedances when they connected new to old. Every junction is a mismatch. Every mismatch feeds the harmonic. The harmonic kills the grid." Veli spoke. Her voice was controlled, precise, carrying the weight of someone defending not just her department but her faith. "The founding grid's impedance profile is defined by the architect prime's original specifications. It cannot be altered." "I am not suggesting you alter the grid," Marin said. "I am suggesting you tune it." "Tune." Veles repeated the word as if it were slightly distasteful. "The Hearthstone distribution network is not an instrument." "Every electrical system is an instrument," Marin said. "If it carries current, it has a resonance. If it has a resonance, it can be tuned. Your grid is 1,700 years old, and it is the most beautiful piece of electrical engineering I have ever seen. But it is playing solo in an orchestra, and no one ever handed it the sheet music for the other parts." Kivrin leaned forward. "And you propose to what? Rewire the Hearthstone?" "I propose to splice impedance-matching leads at every junction where a newer system connects to the old grid. 47 junctions. I have already identified them. Each splice brings the mismatch at that node into harmonic alignment with the grid's fundamental frequency. When all 47 are done, the standing wave collapses. The grid stabilizes. Your shields come back to full." 47 hand-calibrated splices, Veles said, "on a 1,700-year-old sacred grid. By a human surface maintenance worker with a gray badge." "By an electrician," Marin said, "with 34 years of experience and a very good pair of pliers." A murmur moved through the court, not agreement, not disagreement, but the sound of 100 certainties being quietly revised. The court erupted, not into shouting. The Rithani did not shout, ever, under any circumstances. Marin had learned this in her first week. Into the precise, layered, rapid-fire discourse that passed for argument in a culture that treated volume as vulgarity and considered raised voices a sign of intellectual failure. Sevaith argued jurisdiction. Allowing a foreign temporary worker to modify the founding grid would set a precedent that undermined the entire infrastructure hierarchy. Veles argued methodology. Hand-calibrated splices without spectral verification were reckless and potentially sacrilegious. Kivrin argued scope. If the grid required impedance matching, the work should be contracted to a certified interstellar engineering consortium with proper liability coverage and trade agreement infrastructure. Each argument was technically sound. Each one was also designed to protect a position rather than solve a problem. Thren cut through all of them with the blunt pragmatism of a soldier who had run out of patience for procedural debate. Can she fix it or not? That is the only question. The king raised his hand. The discourse stopped. "How long?" he asked Marin. "If I start tonight and work straight through, 4 days. If I have to file a report at each junction and wait for approval, 6 weeks. And if it does not work, then you are exactly where you are now, except you have lost 4 days instead of 6 weeks." The king studied her. His amber eyes were steady, luminous in the half-light, and Marin felt the weight of a judgment being made, not political, not procedural, but personal. He was deciding whether she was real. "Start tonight," he said. The political cost of that decision became apparent within hours. Sevath formally protested, citing jurisdictional precedent and filing a written objection with the court record. Veles submitted a parallel objection, cautioned by 11 of the 14 royal engineers. Kivrin abstained publicly, but began quietly negotiating trade concessions with the Vorath Compact's ambassador on the assumption that the human would fail and foreign contractors would become inevitable. Thren, who had staked her military credibility on the human electrician's ability, stationed a guard at the entrance to the service tunnels ostensibly for security, practically to ensure no one interfered with the work. None of it mattered to Marin. She changed back into her tunnel coveralls, refilled her water flask from the service corridor tap, and went to Junction 1. The Hearthstone hummed beneath her feet as she descended into the sublevel. She could feel it through the soles of her boots, a deep, low vibration that was part electrical and part geological, as if the citadel itself were breathing. The founding engineers had built the grid's primary distribution node directly into the bedrock beneath the Great Hall, tapping into a natural resonance chamber in the stone that amplified and stabilized the power flow. It was, Marin thought, the single most elegant piece of infrastructure she had ever encountered. The rest of the grid extended outward from the Hearthstone like the branches of a tree main trunk lines feeding secondary distributors, feeding tertiary junction nodes, feeding individual room circuits. The tree metaphor was apt. A tree grew. A tree added branches. And if you grafted a branch from a different species onto the trunk, you had better make sure the graft took, or the whole limb would die. 47 grafts. 47 junctions where new met old and nobody had checked whether they were speaking the same electrical language. Marin opened her tool roll, selected her pliers, and began. The work was hard. Not complicated, the principle was simple, and the splices themselves were basic electrical craft, the kind of thing any competent journeyman could do with clean materials and good light. But the execution was grueling. Each junction required a sequence that could not be rushed. Assess the specific impedance mismatch at that node, calculate the correct matching value, select the right gauge of copper core lead from her coil, cut it to the precise length that would add the necessary impedance without adding resistance, strip the insulation by hand with her wire strippers, not her pliers, strippers for stripping, pliers for holding, never cross the tools. Splice the lead into the existing conduit with a solder joint clean enough to pass current without microarcing. And test the result with her probe and her ear. Every splice took between 30 and 90 minutes depending on the complexity of the junction and the stubbornness of the old copper. It was surgery. Every junction was a patient. Every splice was an incision. And every incision had to be clean, because a bad solder joint on a grid carrying this much load would arc, and an arc in crystalline-sheathed copper conduit would propagate faster than she could pull her hands back. She had the scars to prove it, not on this grid, but on others in other tunnels, other lifetimes of crawlspace work where the margin between a clean splice and a hospital visit was measured in the steadiness of her wrist and the accuracy of her heat. It required steady hands, absolute concentration, and the kind of patience that could not be taught, only built, over decades, in tunnels and crawlspaces and utility closets where nobody watched and nobody cared as long as the lights came on. She worked through the first night. Junctions 1 through 8. After each splice she tested the harmonic. At junction 1 the change was imperceptible. At junction 3 she felt a faint flattening in the oscillation, not a correction, but a hint that the grid was registering the adjustment. At junction 5, the lights in the adjacent corridor steadied for a moment, then resumed their flicker, but the flicker was slower. At junction 8, the lights in the corridor brightened by a shade so subtle that only someone who had been watching for it would have noticed. Marin noticed. She sat on the tunnel floor, her back against the conduit wall, her pliers resting on her knee, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. The grid was responding. The ancient copper was accepting the new leads the way an old instrument accepts a new bridge pin, reluctantly at first, then with something that felt like relief. She slept for 3 hours in the tunnel, her head on her tool roll, her back against the warm stone. The heartstone's vibration traveled through the bedrock and into her bones, and she dreamed of copper, miles of it, coiled and bright, humming in a frequency she had never heard before but recognized anyway, the way you recognized a song from your childhood even when you could not remember the words. When she woke, the lights in the tunnel were burning steady. They had not been steady when she fell asleep. Junctions 9 through 12 were in the climate control bypass corridor, the secondary conduit branch she had discovered during her initial survey, the one the Rithani had installed 3 centuries ago without impedance matching the connection points. The bypass was the grid's worst offender. 4 junction mismatches in a row, each one feeding back into the others, creating a localized standing wave that was responsible for roughly 30% of the total harmonic distortion. Fixing it was like untangling a knot. You could not just cut it, you had to work each strand free individually, in the right order, or the tension would shift to the next junction and make it worse. She started with junction 9, the lightest mismatch, and worked inward. Each splice smoothed the local harmonic by a measurable fraction, and each fraction made the next splice easier because the reduced distortion gave the grid more headroom to absorb the correction. By junction 12, the deepest mismatch in the bypass, where the climate control frequency was off by a full octave from the founding grid's base resonance, the grid was calm enough for the splice to take cleanly on the first attempt. Marin soldered the lead, tested it, and pressed her ear against the conduit. The bypass was singing. Not perfectly, it would take the mainline corrections at junctions 13 through 47 to bring it fully into tune, but it was singing. The climate control frequency had dropped into a harmonic relationship with the founding base, and the two were coexisting instead of fighting. In the corridor above her head, Marin heard the soft click of a climate control vent, adjusting its output for the first time in months. The air that came through it was steady, even-tempered, and smelled of the clean ozone that the Rithani ventilation system produced when it was running correctly. She marked junction 12 as complete and moved on. By the second day, the court knew something was happening. The harmonic in the Great Hall had diminished enough for the royal engineers to register it on their spectral analyzers, and Veli's, to her credit, and against her stated position, sent a junior engineer to the tunnels to observe Marin's work. The junior engineer, a young man named Pathan, watched Marin splice junction 15 in silence. She let him watch. She did not explain. She worked strip, measure, twist, solder, test. The impedance at this node was off by 0.3 teraohms, Pathan said, reading his own instruments. Your splice corrected it to within 0.01. 0.008, Marin said, not looking up. How did you calibrate without a spectral analyzer? She held up her hand, fingers spread, the calloused palm facing him. 34 years, she said. The wire tells you if you listen. Pathan left. He filed a report with Veli's. Whatever Veli's classified it under, the result was visible. 2 more junior engineers appeared at the tunnels the next morning. They did not speak to Marin. They watched. One of them, a woman whose name Marin never learned, brought her own instruments and began taking independent readings at each junction after Marin's splices. Her data confirmed what Marin's ears already knew. The impedance corrections were precise, not approximate, not rough cut. Precise, within tolerances that the Rithani's own spectral equipment could barely resolve. The junior engineer stared at her instruments. She looked at Marin. She looked back at her instruments. She said nothing. But she stayed, and she kept measuring. And by the afternoon she had stopped checking Marin's work for errors and started checking it for understanding, trying to learn, from the readings alone, what the human's hands and ears already knew. The political game shifted. Thren, who had staked her position on the human electrician's ability, began to gain ground. Sevath, sensing the change, quietly withdrew his formal protest and repositioned himself as a supporter of decisive practical leadership in times of crisis, his words. delivered to the court with the seamless conviction of a man who had never opposed anything in his life. Kivrin's off-world contractor negotiations stalled as whispers spread through the court that the grid was actually improving. Velis said nothing publicly, but she stopped filing objections, which in the Rithani court was the equivalent of concession, and she increased the number of junior engineers assigned to observe the tunnels from 2 to 5. Junction 22, 25, 28. At Junction 20, Marin found that someone had been in the tunnel ahead of her. The conduit access panel was ajar. The dust pattern on the floor showed footprints Rithani by the size and the narrow heel profile of their formal boots. Someone in court dress had walked the tunnel recently, which was unusual. Court personnel did not visit the service tunnels. They had staff for that. She checked the conduit. Nothing had been disturbed. But the access panel's locking mechanism had been overridden with a code that was not in the maintenance system's standard rotation. Someone with higher clearance than Doran had opened this panel. Marin noted it, relocked the panel, and continued working. She filed no report. She had learned what happened to her reports. At Junction 23, she found what the visitor had been looking for. A secondary monitoring device had been clamped to the conduit's small, well hidden, designed to record the grid's power distribution data in real time. It was not a maintenance instrument. It was a diplomatic intelligence tool. Marin had seen similar devices on military relay stations, where trade delegations sometimes planted listeners to monitor a station's power allocation as a proxy for its defensive readiness. Someone was feeding the Citadel's grid data to an outside party. She looked at the device. She thought about it. She removed it, set it on the tunnel floor, and crushed it with the heel of her boot. Then she spliced Junction 23 and moved on. Later, much later, after everything was finished, she would learn that Kivrin had placed the monitor, not for the Vorath Compact directly, but for the Syndicate Technical Consortium he had been negotiating with. The consortium's terms required proof that the Citadel's grid was beyond internal repair proof that would justify the 14-week contract and the trade agreements attached to it. Kivrin had been building his case. Marin had destroyed it in 2 seconds with her boot heel, and she had not even stopped working. At Junction 30, Marin hit a complication. The conduit at this node was not the original founding copper. It had been replaced at some point, probably during the shield array installation, with a synthetic alloy that had a different thermal coefficient. The splice she had planned would not work. The matching impedance required a different approach, a double lead wound in opposition that would cancel the alloy's thermal drift while matching the founding grid's frequency. It took her 4 hours to design the splice, build it from her diminishing coil of copper, and install it. 4 hours for one junction while the clock ran. She made it work. The harmonic at Junction 30 flattened like a wave hitting a breakwater. The 5 junior engineers, who had been watching in silence, exchanged glances. Pathan, who had returned for the second time, pulled up his spectral readings and shook his head slowly. "That should not have worked," he said. "And yet," Marin said, stripping copper for the next splice. On the third night, the shields jumped from 31% to 57%. Commander Thren reported it to the king in a voice that cracked with relief just once, just a fraction, but Marin heard it through the conduit shaft and recognized it for what it was. A soldier who had been watching her walls fall and had just seen them start to hold. The king said nothing in response to Thren's report. He sent a runner to the tunnels with a flask of water, a plate of food, and a clean cloth for her hands, addressed to the electrician. No name, no badge number, just the title. The runner set the tray down at the junction entrance and left without speaking. Marin ate the food sitting on the tunnel floor between Junction 34 and Junction 35. It was simple bread, some kind of fruit preserve, a dense protein cake that tasted better than it looked. It was also, she realized, from the royal kitchen, not the staff mess. Someone had ordered it specifically. She wiped her hands on the clean cloth, folded it neatly, set it aside, drank the water, and went back to work. At junction 36, Architect Prime Veles came to the tunnels herself. Marin heard her before she saw her, the crisp, measured footsteps of someone who walked corridors of power for a living, now navigating the narrow stone passages of the sublevel with the careful discomfort of a surgeon visiting a boiler room. Veles appeared at the junction entrance wearing her white coat, her silver-white hair pulled back, her amber eyes adjusting to the dim utility lighting. She was carrying a portable spectral analyzer, not the handheld units her junior engineers used, but a full-range instrument the size of a briefcase, the kind that could resolve impedance differentials down to the molecular level. She did not speak. She set the analyzer on the floor, opened it, extended the sensor leads, and clamped them to the conduit on either side of junction 35, the splice Marin had completed 2 hours ago. Marin watched her work. Veles's hands were precise and unhurried. She ran a full spectral sweep, then a harmonic decomposition analysis, then a resonance stability test. Each test took several minutes. The tunnel was quiet except for the hum of the grid and the soft clicks of the analyzer's interface. When the last test completed, Veles stared at the results for a long time. Her face did not change. Her posture did not change. But her hands, resting on the edge of the analyzer's case, were trembling. Not with anger, not with frustration, with the particular tremor of a professional confronting evidence that her training said should not exist. The resonance stability coefficient at this junction is 0.997, Veles said, still looking at the screen. The founding specification is 0.995. You have exceeded the original Architect Prime's tolerances, by hand, without instruments. Marin was stripping copper for junction 36. She did not stop. The Architect Prime's designed for a closed system, she said. They did not need to account for impedance drift from external loads. I do, so the splice has to be tighter. No human hand should be capable of this level of precision. It is not the hand, Marin said. It is the years. Veles closed the analyzer. She stood. She looked at Marin, really looked, for the first time, not at the gray badge or the coveralls or the electrical tape in her hair, but at the woman wearing them. At the hands, at the calluses, at the 34 years of tunnels and crawlspaces and utility closets that had built them. I owe you an apology, Veles said. I blocked your report. I dismissed your assessment. I was wrong. You were protecting your grid, Marin said. I would have done the same. I was protecting my pride. They are not the same thing. Marin looked up. She met Veles's eyes. For a moment, the two women, the Architect Prime in her white coat and the human electrician in her tunnel-grimed coveralls, held each other's gaze across a distance that was not about species or rank or badge color, but about the particular, hard-won respect that one craftsperson gives another when they have watched them work and understood what it cost. Your grid is beautiful, Marin said. The Primes built something worth saving. That is why I am down here. Veles nodded. She picked up her analyzer, turned, and walked back toward the upper levels. At the junction entrance, she paused without turning around. Junction 38 has a secondary bypass that is not on the standard routing maps, she said. It was added during the medical wing expansion 90 years ago. The routing diagrams are in the architect's archive, cabinet 7, third shelf. I will have them sent to you. She left. The routing diagrams arrived at the tunnel entrance within the hour, hand-delivered by Pathan, who set them down without comment and retreated. Marin unfolded them, traced the secondary bypass with her finger, and revised her repair sequence. Veles had been right. The bypass would have cost her half a day of blind searching. Instead, she found it in 20 minutes. Junction 38, 41, 44. At junction 42, the grid did something unexpected. As she soldered the impedance matching lead into place, the conduit beneath her hand warmed. not the warmth of electrical resistance or the residual heat of her soldering pen. A different warmth, deep, slow, emanating from the heartstone far below, traveling through the bedrock and into the copper the way a pulse travels through a body. The founding grid was acknowledging the correction. It was reaching back. Marin had been an electrician for 34 years, and she had never felt anything like it. She pressed both palms flat against the conduit and held still. The warmth traveled up her wrists, through her forearms, into her shoulders. It was not heat, it was resonance. The grid was not just accepting the splices, it was amplifying them, using the impedance corrections to extend its own harmonic reach into the newer systems, drawing them into alignment the way a conductor draws an orchestra into a key. The architect primes had built this capability into the grid. They had anticipated that someday someone would tune it. They had made it ready to be tuned. They had just been waiting for the right hands. She took a slow breath. She soldered junction 43, then 44. The harmonic was dying. Marin could feel it in the walls. The oscillation that had been a constant companion for the past month was fading, smoothing, integrating into the grid's fundamental frequency like a dissonant note resolving into a chord. The founding grid was not being repaired. It had never been broken. It was being reintroduced to the systems it had been sharing a body with for 4 centuries, systems it had never been properly introduced to. And it was responding the way any well-built thing responds to proper care, by working. At junction 45, Marin ran out of copper. Her coil, the one she had carried for years, the good copper, the stuff she trusted, was gone. She had enough for 1 more splice. She needed 3. She sat on the tunnel floor and looked at the bare end of the coil. She rubbed her thumb over the cut end, feeling the familiar softness of high-grade copper, and thought about the synthetic lead in the Citadel's maintenance supply. She did not trust synthetic lead. It was fine for standard runs, adequate for modern installations, but for impedance-matching work on a 1,700-year-old grid, you needed copper that behaved like copper consistently, predictably, without the micro-variations that synthetic alloys introduced at extreme precision. She thought about it for 5 minutes. Then she unwound her voltage tester's internal leads, pure copper, hand-wound, part of the tester since she had built it 23 years ago, and cut them free. The tester would still work with the Citadel's standard leads. Her pliers would still bite. Her ears would still hear. You gave the wire what the wire needed. That was the job. She finished junction 45 with the tester's copper, junction 46 with the last of her coil. Junction 47, the final splice, deep in the subbasement beneath the shield array's primary emitter, with a length of copper she recovered from a decommissioned relay she found in a storage alcove, testing its purity by touch and by the sound it made when she flicked it with her fingernail. Good copper rang. Bad copper thudded. This copper rang. She soldered the final lead at 3 in the morning on the 4th day. She tested the impedance with her rebuilt probe. She pressed her palm flat against the conduit wall. The hum was clean, pure. A single clear frequency, steady as a heartbeat, carrying the full load of every system in the Citadel without strain. The standing wave was gone. The grid was whole. Marin sat on the floor. She closed her eyes. She listened to the hum the way you would listen to a friend, breathing in their sleep with attention and without worry. Then she packed her tools. The shields came back to full within the hour. Commander Thren confirmed it from the command deck, her voice carrying through the Citadel's internal communication system deliberately. Marin was certain so that every faction and functionary heard it. 100% shield integrity. Grid stable. Harmonic eliminated. The court reconvened in the Great Hall, and for the first time in nearly a year, the hall looked the way the architect primes had intended it to look. The lighting array blazed at full power, and the dome overhead erupted in the full-spectrum radiance its designers had envisioned 17 centuries ago, crystal white and deep blue and warm gold, layered and blended, the light itself a kind of music, frequencies harmonizing the way the grid's frequencies now harmonized, the visible manifestation of an electrical system that was finally, after 400 years of struggle, whole. The courtiers looked up. Some of them had never seen the dome at full power. They had grown up with the flicker, accepted it as normal, assumed it was an artifact of age. It was not. It was the sound of something beautiful trying to sing with a hand over its mouth, and the hand had just been removed, and the song was blinding. Maren was not summoned. She heard the session through the tunnels as she made her way back to her quarters. Thren presented the shield data. Veles confirmed the harmonics' disappearance in language so carefully neutral that it simultaneously acknowledged the human's competence and preserved her department's institutional standing. Sevath praised the king's decisive leadership in authorizing unconventional solutions. Kivrin was silent. The king spoke last. The grid was not broken, he said. It was untuned. 1,700 years of additions, and no one thought to check whether the old and the new were speaking the same language. A human electrician with a pair of pliers and 34 years of experience heard what our engineers could not. She listened to the wires. That is all she did. She listened. He paused. I would like to speak with her. Maren was in her quarters when the runner came. She was packing. Her duffel was open on the cot, her coveralls folded inside it, her tool roll already buckled and slung over the bag's handle. She had washed her hands and face in the basin and changed into the one clean shirt she had brought. She looked exactly like what she was, a worker who had finished a job and was getting ready to leave. The runner hesitated at the sight of the packed bag. The king requests your presence in the private study, she said. Maren left the bag on the cot and followed the runner through corridors she had never seen wider, brighter, lined with the pale stone and crystal-threaded glass of the royal wing. The private study was a small room by citadel standards, maybe 20 feet square, with a window that overlooked the inner garden and a desk made of dark, heavy wood she did not recognize. The walls were lined with shelves holding data crystals and actual bound volumes. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting warm amber light. Outside the window, the citadel's restored exterior array cast the garden paths in cool blue-white, warm and cool together. The Rithani built beautiful things. King Arathan was standing by the window. He turned when she entered. Without the throne and the court and the 30 feet of protocol distance, he was different, still imposing, still geological in his patience, but present in a way that the ceremonial setting had not allowed. His amber eyes were steady on her face, and in their glow she saw something she had not expected to see from a king: respect. Not gratitude, not relief. Respect, the kind one tradesperson gives another when they have watched them work and understood what it cost. You are packed, he said. The job is done. I was going to offer you a position, Architect Prime Emeritus. It is a title reserved for engineers who have made a contribution of lasting significance to the Citadel's infrastructure. It has never been offered to someone outside the Rithani. That is generous. It comes with permanent quarters, a full royal stipend, access to the Hearthstone, and a seat at the Infrastructure Council. You would advise my engineers, train them. Teach them to hear what you hear. Maren looked at the lamp on his desk. It was burning steady and bright with none of the flicker that had plagued the Citadel for almost a year. Clean light, clean current. She had done that. Not the title, not the stipend, not the seat at the council. That lamp, that steady glow. I appreciate it, she said, truly, but I am an electrician, not an architect. I do not belong at a council table. I belong in the tunnels, and your tunnels are tuned. You could find new ones to tune. I always do. That is the job. You go where the wires need you. Right now they do not need me here. The king was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned. The garden beyond the window glowed blue-white and amber. Your report, Arathan said. The one that was filed and ignored. I have read it, every page. I know. You knew the problem from the second day. You mapped it in 3 weeks. You filed the solution and no one listened. And you stayed. The wires do not care who is listening. They just need someone to tune them. Is that what you will tell them at the next station, when they ask why you left a royal appointment? Marin smiled. It was a small smile, creased and tired, the kind that lived in the lines around her eyes and had been earned one junction at a time, one crawlspace at a time, one ignored report at a time. It was the smile of a person who had spent 34 years being invisible and had made peace with it so completely that visibility felt like a coat that did not fit. They will not ask, she said. Nobody asks the electrician anything. That is the job. The king reached into the shelf behind him and pulled out a small object, a cylinder of dark metal, about the size of a human thumb, engraved with the founding script in silver inlay. He held it out. Then take this. It is not a title. It is not a stipend. It is a founder's key. It opens every maintenance access point in the citadel. There are only 3 in existence. The architect primes built them into the original grid for the workers who would maintain it. The workers, not the engineers. The primes understood the difference. Marin looked at the key. She looked at the king. If I am ever in the sector again, she said, and your wires start humming wrong, I will come back. You will not need to post the job. I will hear it. She took the key. She put it in her tool roll next to her pliers, where it would ride against the copper, and the solder and the wire strippers where it belonged. The king nodded. It was a small nod, barely perceptible, the kind of acknowledgement that carried weight precisely, because it was not performed for an audience. It was the nod of a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and who had just met someone who wanted nothing except to do her work and leave. She left a note on his desk, 4 words unsigned. The wires remember you. The king found it after she had gone. He read it twice. He held the paper up to the lamplight, turning it, as if the handwriting itself might tell him something about the woman who had written it, the pressure of the pen, the steadiness of the strokes, the way the letters were formed with the efficient, unhesitating clarity of someone who documented her work the same way she performed it, without flourish, without ambiguity, and without any expectation that anyone would read it. He set the note on the shelf beside the founding charter, in a clear protective case, between a 1700-year-old engineering specification and a data crystal containing the original Hearthstone activation protocols. It was the only item on the shelf that was not thousands of years old. It was also, by the archivist's later assessment, the only item on the shelf that the king had placed there himself. 3 years later, the archivists found it. They spent weeks trying to determine its significance and its author. They never did because they were looking in the wrong records, the engineering archives, the diplomatic logs, the court proceedings. They did not think to check the maintenance files. Nobody ever checked the maintenance files. Marin took the cargo shuttle back to Threshold 9. She unpacked her duffel in a rented room above a cantina that smelled like engine coolant and someone's attempt at Terran coffee. She hung her tool roll on the back of the door. She checked the local labor exchange for postings. There was a junction box on level 3 that had been humming wrong for a week. Nobody had filed a report. Nobody ever did. The station's maintenance chief, a tired Corvini man with 3 staff and a budget for 2, had flagged it as low priority and moved on to the sewage recycler that was actually broken. The junction box could wait. Junction boxes always waited because junction boxes did not complain, did not file grievances, did not send threatening diplomatic messages. They just hummed, quietly, wrongly, until someone came along who could hear the difference. Marin could hear the difference. She had always been able to hear the difference. It was not a gift. It was not talent. It was the accumulated weight of 34 years of showing up, of putting her hands on the wire, of listening when nobody else thought there was anything worth listening to. It was, in the end, the simplest thing in the universe. She paid attention to the things that everyone else had decided did not matter, and it turned out that those things mattered more than anyone knew. She put on her coveralls, picked up her pliers, and went to work. The founder's key, tucked in her tool roll between the pliers and the wire strippers, pressed against her hip as she knelt beside the junction box. She did not think about it. She thought about the hum. She thought about the wire. She thought about the 34 years of practice that had brought her here, to another tunnel, another wrong note, another problem that nobody else had noticed, and that she would fix without being asked and without being thanked. The lights came on steady. Nobody noticed. That was the job.